why the need to rebrand?
Wawasan negara, honestly, right now is the buzzword, right?
There's this widespread disillusionment, when it comes to PH fulfilling its reforms.
And I quote, I don't want UMNO to be led by political cowards.
And I don't know whether that's like a career assassination for him or like he's like, swan song. Hello everyone, welcome to yet another episode of Beyond the Headlines, the go-to space for the top stories that made the headlines and more. I'm Amalina Kamal.
And I'm Juliana Jalaluddin. So, Parliament is back in session. And unlike previous sittings, this one feels significantly more consequential. Because why? Not necessarily because of number of bills being tabled, but because of where we are politically, right, Lola?
That's right, because the government is entering the latter half of its term, and naturally the conversations are shifting. Of course, for almost 4 years, Malaysians have been wondering, where is the institutional reform that's being promised? The question today is whether or not this particular parliament sitting is indeed a make it or break it sort of platform for the government before, election considerations begin dominating the political landscape. And when we talk about reforms, there are among them some core ones, of course, that's frequently discussed in the past general elections, which a lot of people are vying for. One of it is the separation of the Attorney General and the Public Prosecutor, the parliamentary reforms, the political financing laws, and efforts to ensure that our governance and accountability measures are made more transparent.
Right, but then, Lola, you listed all these things. Before we go in any further into our discussion, but maybe you could expound on why these are important for the viewers to know.
All right. So I think I'll start with the separation of the Attorney General and the Public Prosecutor first.
Yeah.
Right. Because as it is right now, having these two being united, right, actually gives immense power to the government's legal advisor in terms of who can be charged or will be charged. And I think if you notice, at least in this particular administration alone, right, the first 2 years at least, in the form of MACC crackdowns, there's a lot of high-profile figures being called in for questioning
Right.
and having to be charged in court. And the arguments that come out of it is always, this is a selective persecution towards the present administration.
Yeah.
So when it comes to optics, it's not necessarily great to the, the PM or at least the government that he represents because, that's a reflection of how you want to maintain public peace as well, and whether or not the Madani administration is indeed, in fact, democratic.
Yeah.
So the Attorney General and the Public Prosecutor having to be separated is not necessarily also isolated to this particular administration alone. This is a legacy thing, right?
Yeah.
So, and when we talk about having to be more progressive, more, how do you say it, like democratic in that sense, the separation of the two roles here, having to have that conflict of interest needs to be attended to. So that's one reform.
That seems fairly quite fair.
And then I think the parliamentary reforms itself, on that particular aspect, right, the state and federal legislatures historically lack robust check and balance mechanism. And it's pretty straightforward because our parliament is an extension of the executive, right?
Yep.
Arguments, again, falls back to, PM has absolute power. And that's what we don't want, especially when it comes to the parliament makeup here, because you have the MPs and then you have the House itself is where you present bills, you present policies.
Yeah, exactly.
The actual reforms, the reforms that we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
So you can't talk about reforms having to present it in a House that actually has that sort of like another redundancy, another conflict of interest. And the political financing law, the other reform here, I think we saw some sort of like milestone, especially when it comes to the anti-hopping law, but there are some grey areas still, because when it comes to having this absence of having to regulate campaigns and having to ensure that, certain laws are intact to ensure the tracking when it comes to who funds a particular campaign, who doesn't, it begs the question of like whether or not the voting or the makeup of the certain result of a certain area is rigged from the start, and we don't want that, right?
But at least the bottom line is the goal is to make politics more transparent, right?
Yes,
and it's to reduce corruption as well, and then to prevent wealthy individuals from undue influence towards over elections or government decisions even.
True,
so that's
true.
that's the end and go for having that political financing laws.
Last but not least, of course, when it comes to the governance and the accountability measures here, it's a bit vague, right? But it comes in the form of the Freedom of Information Act, because as it is right now, Malaysia does not have that. What it means to have the Freedom of Information Act is to not have this secrecy towards procurements, towards information that the public should know. Like, okay, let's say if an example, your state is supposed to have this high-profile project being done, and 5 years down the road, nothing's happening. So you want to access that information. As it is right now, only 2 states has this FOI sort of law, where the public can access. But although a lot of people are saying that the tediousness of having to even gain those information can be contested, but only 2 states dalam Malaysia ini yang ada, Selangor dengan Penang. What we want is everyone should be across nationwide.
Everyone
right?
else has to participate as well.
Yeah.
But of course, the challenge at the moment is timing, right? Because we were talking about parliament sitting before the state election.
Betul.
Starts, the Johor and Negeri Sembilan, but Johor is yang paling the first one lah.
Yeah.
Because I mean, while the government may want Parliament to focus on reforms, political parties also are increasingly looking forward for the state elections, and that applies not just to the government, because it applies to the opposition as well. The heated drama going on within government and opposition coalition.
And what's actually happening on that front, the opposition front, right? Because we saw a lot of developments, especially earlier in the week, right? So many. And then one thing, yes, you've said it correctly, because in Parliament, honestly, it doesn't operate in isolation, right? What happens outside might trickle inside as well. And when it comes to political parties debating the reforms, we want something that actually holds within the House itself. So the contests, or the future contests, the alliances that happens outside needs to be factored in as well lah.
Yeah, you're right, because nowhere is that more evident than within the opposition, because where recent developments have raised broader questions about coalition stability, their political strategy, and also their role of the opposition, itself, right?
The check and balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This week we have seen so many layers of developments involving Perikatan Nasional, involving including discussions surrounding coalition punya arrangements, right? And strategy and preparations ahead of the electoral contest. So, talking about Perikatan Nasional, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, because of course, on Monday, they had an emergency meeting,
June
right?
22nd
at PAS headquarters, right? In the particular meeting, they actually also introduced 2 new party entries into the coalition itself, in the form of Pejuang and Parti Cinta Malaysia. Now, of course, a lot of people might have heard of Pejuang before, but Parti Cinta Malaysia not so much. But Parti Cinta Malaysia actually is an active party. Cuma after joining the Perikatan Nasional coalition, they've rebranded themselves. They've rebranded into
Parti Wawasan
Negara lah, which is led by
which was announced by Hamzah
and Hadi during the Reset punya convention.
Exactly.
So what was the makeup here, and is PCM now defunct, and then macam mana? Actually, to be fair, it's a rebrand. Because the president of PCM apparently is now the vice president of Parti Wawasan Negara juga, one of the vice presidents lah. But in the lineup of Parti Wawasan Negara, so you've got the chairman,
which is
led by Tan Sri Rais Yatim, and then the president, of course, Datuk Sri Hamzah Zainuddin, and then the Timbalan president, which is Tan Lek Kang, and then the secretary general, Datuk Sri Safidi Abdullah, and the information chief being in the form of one Ahmad Faisal, one Ahmad. But then again, I think outside of the set, Julie, we were talking about this particular new party. They don't have a constitution, right?
No, they don't have a party constitution yet. But what's a bit vague and a bit confusing for me is that why the need to rebrand? Like Bersama, it's a takeover. The name stays the same, right? It was a dormant party, and then Rafizi Ramli takes over the party, and then so dia bukan tukar nama. So when it comes to Cinta, when Hadi announced it that they're going to launch new party Wawasan Negara, we were like, oh, okay, it's a new setup party, boleh ke macam tu? But now they're saying that no, Wawasan is actually a rebrand of Parti Cinta. But why? What I don't get is why the need to to change into a new name.
Understood.
So what difference will it make, and then how will they be unique to the political landscape in this era now?
I think I might be wrong in this, but having to understand the optics of how our voter makeups are, kan, maybe PCM has their own demographics. Wawasan coming in with his whatever baggage has their own sort of supporters. So, and if you factor in between Parti Wawasan Negara and PCM, Wawasan Negara, honestly, right now is the buzzword, right? A lot of attention towards it. People are also excited. But when you talk about PCM, no offense to the brand or the people that made it up, in that sense, perhaps they could write better on the Wawasan Negara, I suppose, umbrella ataupun branding lah, right? Yeah. But these two, well, not these two lah, because it's already been rebranded. They are effectively a Perikatan Nasional member. So what's interesting is moving forward into the state elections, how this particular dynamic would be. Like there are smaller seats or smaller constituencies whereby Pejuang is there. PCM not so much. But it's interesting to see because, time can only tell. We have about till July 11th, till the Johor state elections to come, before we can understand how the opposition dynamics would factor in, especially when it comes to election strategy.
And talking about dynamics, there's also this contest between Bersatu and PAS.
Yes.
Because if you've been following the news, they're saying that, they want to disconnect from Bersatu despite being in the same coalition. So they're like contesting against each other within the same house. So when it comes to Johor election, they're saying that, okay, we're going to contest this, and then Bersatu will contest some of the areas that will overlap. So they're going to go against each other. So what's interesting is that, because usually, correct me if I'm wrong, generally known that Bersatu, when they contest in Johor, they have a strong support from PAS, right, in terms of machinery and also support from on the grassroots. So now that's not going to happen because PAS is contesting, Bersatu is contesting, logging heads at each other. So which means that it's definitely going to be a split of votes for the opposition coalition, right?
No, because it's interesting that you say that, because analysts do have this particular argument whereby they are actually openly questioning whether or not the coalition itself, Perikatan Nasional, right, will actually survive long term, having to have this internal sort of friction. Because the current
opposition within the opposition.
Yeah, the position within the opposition. And how is that going to be? Opposition now, but later on, let's say, if they do win a simple majority, for instance, they have to think about this, right? At the end of the day, the Rakyat will go out to vote. They will go to the ballot box. But what they want at the end of the day is stability and a cohesive sort of synergy between all the members here. And this is not just on the opposition side. It's the administration side. Because when you say about having to have two parties who are formerly friends, and then now they're having to contest head on, that's politics, right? It's happening with BN as well, with PH. They're going head to head. And BN has, again, expressly said that it's going to contest all seats, especially when it comes to the Johor state elections here.
Exactly. Same like BN. They're going to contest all 56 seats, definitely. So some of those areas or constituencies will have BN against PH punya candidate.
But I just want to draw back, because we've thrown out all these considerations, the points, and I suppose when we start factoring in everything that we've thrown out, right, the question actually stands again: how would the current parliament sitting actually be reflective of whether or not the government's last meaningful sort of runway to actually deliver institutional reforms? Is it going to still be on the current administration? Of course, because that's like a performance punya report, right? Later on, that's going to be reflective of whether or not I'm going to still vote for this particular administration going into the GE16, not just state elections. And what we want to also understand is whether or not can politicians themselves actually stay focused when it comes to governing a nation, a plural society such as us.
When's the nomination again? 27th of June. So
correct,
that's
for state elections. And then July 11th is when they will be, Johorians at least, will be going to the polls. But of course, without just having us both having to share our insights,
quick recap,
to say. Yeah, a quick recap first. We're going to segue into an interview that we had earlier with Associate Professor Dr. Azmil Tayeb on the matter.
We can already see the trend, right, of PH supporters slowly disengaging themselves, from the political process, not turning out to vote. We can see that in recent by-elections, Sungai Bakap, particularly, so much lower turnout in non-Malay areas. So there's this widespread disillusionment, when it comes to PH fulfilling its reforms. And then there's a perception that PH is focusing more on getting the Malay votes. So because it's somewhat feel assured by the vote bank, the non-Malay vote banks. So the non-Malays generally feel that they've been taken for granted. So I think the PH are now, I think, realizing that they can no longer ignore the non-Malay voters. Especially, we know that the election is around the corner, and they need the non-Malays, especially to turn out in droves for them to have any chance of being competitive or even winning. Because lower turnout from the non-Malays would spell doom for PH. So, and then one way to energize, or rather to re-energize the PH voters is to at least make an effort towards implementing some of these reforms or fulfilling some of these reform promises.
We totally understand when it comes to certain reforms, right? It does take time, it does take consensus. But as elections calculation intensifies, right, certain reforms are harder to achieve because there's no political will. Some argue that. But when we are discussing this, we tend to frame it based on voter demographic, macam the Malays, non-Malays. Tapi when it comes to macam institutional reforms like the political financing legislation and even certain parliamentary reforms or at least oversight mechanism macam the FOI, the Freedom of Information, to ensure that we get public records to hold certain procurements into account, don't you think that it's high time for us to basically look at the promises as something that's not just good, not just for a certain demographic, but to all?
Ideally, we would want the government in power to do to act on something that's good for everyone, that's for the good of the general public. And these are some of the good governance, reforms that they've been promising. I see like separation between the Attorney General and the Public Prosecutor's Office, term limit to the Prime Minister, Political Financing Act, Parliamentary Services Act. All these things there are good reforms, and some of these reforms are even low-hanging fruits, so to speak. They can be achieved with very little political will, but yeah, it seems like there's a perception that the government PH, especially the Prime Minister, seems not willing to expend political capital on realizing these reforms. So there's this perception that it is focusing more on getting re-elected. In the next election, is looking towards the next instead of focusing on the on the here and now, which is the getting these reforms in place. As you've rightly said, it's getting more difficult now because component parties, of course, whatever decisions that they make now, whatever strategy they make is all made in the context of the election, right? So whether it helps or not helping them, in the next election. So even when it comes to voting in the parliament, right? So so that makes it really difficult. So instead of thinking beyond their own party self-interest or beyond electoral calculation, now they instead of thinking of in terms of the public goods in general. So I think it's getting more difficult, but it's not to say that it's not achievable, it's not attainable. I think some of these reform efforts has already been in the works for quite some time. The Azalina's office, been working with various stakeholders, civil society organizations, various groups, and drafting these laws to be tabled in the parliamentary sitting. So, but I guess but ultimately the proof is in the pudding, right? So when it's put out for vote later on, and we'll see if this government is serious about getting these reforms passed, as because we can see when the term limit was tabled, the parliament, it wasn't, it failed spectacularly, with just 2 votes, right?
Two
So
votes short. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so I thought that was. Yeah, I mean, it's missed opportunity for one, but also I feel that there's lack of seriousness when it comes to the government, on the government side, for something that's of this magnitude, of this importance, and not to get it passed, not to use every power or political will at its disposal, to get it passed.
If this particular parliamentary sitting does not necessarily promise us any major breakthroughs,
Mhm.
even I want to say incremental reforms pun, I'm not too sure because we have to see the next few weeks macam mana, right? But
Yeah.
if let's say this parliamentary sitting ends without any major breakthrough, what sort of political message does that send to the general public, especially going in ahead of JE16?
In reality, I think the PH will take whatever win they can get, and then campaign on that. Perhaps say that, okay, yes, I mean, we could have started earlier with the reforms, but hey, it's better late than never. We still have the small win. We can build from the small win. If you re-elect us, if you put us in government again, next term. So I think something that they can definitely campaign on. So it's rather just to have something than not having anything at all.
When we talk about the check and balance process, right, our opposition, especially in today's context, is considered like quite a strong dynamic. However, in the past month alone, we saw a lot of shake-ups, and dari segi Bersatu and PAS ni, having to contest who actually is the basically key maker within Perikatan Nasional. It's very upsetting, at least for those who not necessarily apa kata vote for them pun. It's just macam, why is it more split today? So
Yeah.
so from a parliamentary and constitutional perspective, actually could changes within a certain coalition have actual implications when it comes to parliament stability here?
I don't think we have experienced parliamentary stability since Sheraton move. Just to be honest, because I mean, first of all, we no longer have a stable two-party system, right? So typically when we have the first past the post system, electoral system, then it will lead to a two-party system. I mean, that's how it usually is, right? But then, as we have seen, of course, like the pandemic is a whole, is a world unto itself. But then even after the pandemic, GE15, we have hung parliament, we have three major parties or three major coalitions that emerged, right, from the G15, and then that's not including the Sarawak, the Sabah and Sarawak coalitions, right? So definitely our political landscape is much more fragmented. So what's a few more cracks here and there, to add to the already existing, deeply fragmented landscape. Of course, PAS wants to be in the driving position because it holds the most seat, right, 43 seats as opposed to Bersatu, and then of course Bersatu does not want to play second fiddle to PAS. So you have this kind of back and forth that ultimately led to the implosion, right, within PN, within Bersatu as well, because you have Bersatu like Hamzah, who and his faction, now the Wawasan, right, wanting to work closely with PAS, right, as opposed to the Muhyiddin faction. So I feel that there will be definitely a lot more competitive, a lot more contests. I can see that happening. I think starting with Johor, everyone will lose out, right? So if they all decide to contest, right, you will split the Malay vote, the conservative or nationalist Malay votes, and then it will be to the benefit of I mean, I wouldn't say PH also, because PH is also fragmented, right? Because you have now Bersama, you have, Muda. It's really hard to say, but I think, unless if they somehow can come to an understanding that maybe for this seat we will sit out and let the other, maybe someone that they can potentially see themselves working with down the road. So maybe it's not through a formal coalition, but maybe because they're ideologically similar or almost similar.
Tapi do you think that's one part of the reason why PAS wants to contest under its own banner? Because let's say on state level, if let's say they win, I mean, I'm not too sure, because to be fair, it has not necessarily made big inroads yet in Johor. However, if let's say certain seats they dapat, they can fall to BN at least, or or a certain, or maybe the PH macam tu. Is that one of the reasons? Do you think so?
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely the PAS in certain parts of the country, the PAS's logo definitely has that brand recognition, right? Everyone knows Pati Bule, so the definitely that, right? But of course, it can also be to PAS's detriment as well, because in some parts that it's not, PAS is not really well liked, especially in UMNO strongholds. The where the voting demographic, the Malays, maybe perhaps more nationalistic than Islamic, perhaps Islamic oriented. So places like Johor or Malacca or Negeri Sembilan, for example, right? So it might be risky for PAS to contest in the states using its own logo, right? So maybe it's better to contest under different banner, I mean, because there are people like who wants to work with UMNO, for example, right? Maybe they contest under BN. So I think that there are a lot of these permutations, because you can have like in G15, right? So you have PAS in the in Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah. They use their own logos, right? During campaign period, and then but in other states they use PN logo. So I imagine like your average voter not gonna dig into this one, the two. They just know this is PN candidate, but they don't know if this candidate is PAS, or if they had known that this is a PAS candidate, they might not vote for that person, right? Because maybe they have this some kind of visceral hate towards PAS or something. So, but then because it's a PN candidate, so and then they don't bother checking the background of the candidate, so they say, oh, I'll just vote, because I just vote for this guy because he's PN.
No, but then the existing situation is also like having to contest under Perikatan Nasional is much more complicated now.
Yeah, I mean, it was simpler back then. Yeah, the good old days. Like
I mean,
3 years
as an
ago.
alternative, right? So people
Yeah.
are actually fine under Perikatan Nasional, at least it's solid, But then now also it's very fragmented. So
Yeah,
I think rightfully so. It's more split for the Malay Muslim votes in this particular context. Okay, since we're already speaking about elections and so state level, right? The latest update to Johor is obviously Datuk Dr. Puad Zarkashi has actually left UMNO. I mean, he resigned. But in his resignation sort of speech, he also said, "Let me resign instead of being pecat."
Yeah.
And he expressed that, or initially he hinted that, oh, Johor UMNO, there's something wrong because it's not free, right? And then Drew Besar on Hafiz Ghazi, he's like a yes man. That's a very strong statement to make, right?
Yeah.
And if Puad Zarkashi is actually saying that he's compelled to do this political exercise and mark it as political courage, isn't it like also tarnishing UMNO's image as a result? Because there are a lot of people who are saying that, see, even UMNO cannot keep their people together.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned before, this is purely out of frustration and exasperation, I guess. Nothing revolutionary about the statement, but yes, of course, I think it can only come from UMNO lah, so it can only come from someone like him. So I think if it had come from someone else, from PH or from or God forbid, DAP or something, then there would be like a national crisis, But coming from him, yeah, I think. But for me, ultimately, it's not something that I think, especially Malay voters, base their voting preference on. I don't think it will affect how people vote, right? I think what matters to people is that if UMNO, especially people who are leaning towards UMNO or UMNO's base, they're voters, that what kind of economic agenda that UMNO can bring to the table, especially in particular Johor, right? Bringing more jobs, or maybe supporting Johorians who work in Singapore, or how do you, lower the cost of living? How do you deal with wage stagnation? Things that the real bread and butter issues, real challenges faced by regular average people.
You have to remember, actually, Johor on Hafiz actually secured a historic high of 110 billion ringgit of approved investments, right? But like a lot of people tend to perhaps brush that over because it's not trickling in terms of the lived reality of the economic climate, is it?
I think that that's always the case. Even like you hear that from PMX or from the other ministers, right? Or Malaysia, we have received tens of billions of dollars of FDIs and things. But people are not seeing that in their in their daily in their lived experience, day to day experience, and so that it makes people question that who are actually benefiting from all this supposedly this all this economic rising economic indicator, whatever, so if it's not translated into what people experience in their daily lives, then it doesn't matter at all. If UMNO in this case can come up with something that can propose an agenda that actually deals with this in concrete terms, I think this fallout that from what Zarkashi's bomb, I guess, bombshell, it's not going to affect them at all.
I mean, because earlier we mentioned about the institutional reforms and whether or not this parliament sitting can actually be the, I suppose, the brownie points for the present administration for them to fare better in the coming elections. That's one, and also developments within Perikatan Nasional and debates within UMNO itself. But I think the whole real question is not necessarily whether reforms ataupun promises are made, but whether or not there's enough political space to deliver the promises.
Yeah.
To end this particular discourse,
Mhm.
for Johor itself, do you think it will still fall back to the incumbent?
let me take out my crystal ball and no, I think it will stay with the incumbent. I think the on Hafiz has good approval rating from people. I think he's a non-controversial figure, right? He's young and dynamic. I think he's at least he has that perception, that image. And Johor, I mean relative to other states, is doing quite well, I guess. Right. So I don't see any drastic changes, in the upcoming. I think BN UMNO will retain the state government and the chief ministership. I think it's a matter of, I think the more concern, I mean, even despite the fragmentation, I think when ultimately people will choose stability, people will choose status quo. Why fix something that's not broken, right? So I think ultimately, I think that's what that's a deciding factor. I think that's what people will be basing their voting preference on.
This is backed on track record of Johor itself, because yes, it is indeed the highest in terms of states among all Malaysian states that has achieved the GDP growth rate 6.5%, right? So, so yes, why change things that's not broken? Thank you so much, Prof.
Okay, you're welcome, Amina.
So, well, Prof. Dr. Azmil has a lot to say, especially when it comes to the dynamics of the opposition, how that will factor in, moving forward, and the institutional reform being a bit like how do I say, a point of reference for the wider nation to see, can the PH administration, PH alone, not the unity government, deliver its manifestos. But there are a lot of apologists are also saying, because it's very hard when you have a super coalition
indeed,
sort of framework here, right? But Azmil also did mention, with the latest kerfuffle that came out of Johor now, heading towards the election, is in the form of Puad Zarkashi, right?
Yep.
Having to resign after hinting to us on Wednesday there is something wrong with Johor UMNO.
Yeah, he said that tidak bebas. UMNO is not freed from influence. It's quite a bold statement, actually.
It is. And I don't know whether that's like a career assassination for him or like he's like, swan song before.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
obviously he's all like, he resigned from the party and expressively saying before dia kena pecat.
I mean, he did say that before he announced his resignation from UMNO. He did say few days before that he doesn't want to contest anymore because he wants to give way to younger candidates to contest because by the time if he holds another term, then it will be his age will catch up on him lah. So now
He's a realist lah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
He's a
it's
realist.
understandable. It's understandable. But now he's saying that he's resigned but he made such a bold statement. The reason why he's leaving UMNO, right?
Well, he did say there are many
He did say,
examples.
many examples, but the one that caught our attention the most is like leaving UMNO because UMNO is no longer free to make its own decision.
He also, again, pushed further by saying on Hafiz is merely a yes man.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that he makes such bold statement. He's saying that, and I quote, "I don't want UMNO to be led by political cowards who cause BN candidates to be mocked as recycled, uninspiring and mediocre." And he also said that he knows that his decision might invite criticism and his statement is making and even threats to his safety. But he said that he was prepared to face the consequences. That's quite I admire the courage to make that statement, but also Johor has been, as we all know, the crown jewel of UMNO, and making such decision to leave UMNO in leading up to the polls where it's just a few days away, that's quite how to say
I mean, having to say that, right, he did mention it's a needed political courage that he just felt compelled to kind of macam be so transparent in such a way, right? Because before whatever situation worsens, it's still very cryptic. Certain levels, he's very, how do we say this? Very head-on, very transparent. But on the other aspect, there's a lot more questions here.
Yeah, exactly. Because he has been saying that there's things not right within UMNO Johor.
Betul. Things will develop further. Not too sure if Puad himself will be making more statements because again, it would not reflect if, let's say, he's saying that he's doing this for the party, but whatever he's throwing out is also tarnishing the party's image. You get what I mean?
Yeah, the highlight of this period as well.
Yeah, betul, correct.
Dia bukan macam months before or weeks before the resolution. It's just like within days before the nomination itself and the campaign is about to start. Puad is a very strong, one of the strong figure in UMNO. So whatever he says is going to be quite impactful to the image and the narrative of UMNO, right?
Itself. Well, unfortunately, that's the end of today's episode. If you do like this particular episode, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to also turn on the notification bell. You'll not only get NSC Beyond the Headlines update, other NSC Online's news reports will be delivered to you. Now, of course, follow us on our socials. We're everywhere. Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, as well as Threads. My name is Amalina Kamal.
And again, I'm Juliana Jalaluddin. Thank you so much for joining us.
And we'll see you guys next week.